I was that consumer. I was kind of a wine nerd who was always actually quite fussy about what I was drinking.
The non-alcoholic alternatives were just such a game changer for me.
I guess it was pertinent to me that I understood fine wine.
It just tastes like alcohol. It's the first thing that I can taste. I am Michelle O'Brien. Welcome to the Upward Spiral podcast, Drink Less to Live More. I am so excited today to introduce you to Amanda Thomson, founder of B-Corp Certified Thomson & Scott Noughty non-alcoholic wine. So Noughty was the first non-alcoholic wine that I tried that didn't taste like grape juice.
Thank you.
It actually tasted like real sparkling wine and was an absolute game changer for me. So Amanda is a trailblazer in the industry and is on a mission to create the most perfect alcohol-free wine. Just wait until you hear her story. Hello, Amanda.
Hi.
Welcome to Singapore. And,
Thank you for having me.
To our beautiful podcast studio at Podster. How are you feeling?
Truthfully jet lagged, but excited to be here. I literally just landed last night, so it's my morning, but our afternoon, so...
I do the trip often and it can be confusing. My only advice is eat when you should be eating. Eat at the right time.
I've probably already busted that one.
Oh, and it's Singapore as well, so you've got to have some of our incredible food.
I'm super excited to do that. That's definitely on my to-do list. Good food.
Absolutely. Thank you. I really appreciate you coming to talk to me today.
No, it's a pleasure.
You are in town for Pro Wine.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit why you're here.
Sure. I mean, that was sort of the linchpin. So I think it's fair to say it's the world's leading wine event where the great and the good of the wine industry come together. And since we're a wine brand that happens to be non-alcoholic, stay with me, I'm sure we'll get into the semantics and break that down. So a wine brand that happens to be non-alcoholic, it's really important to us to be at the heart of the wine industry. So when we were invited to be here and take the first ever non-alcoholic masterclass at Pro Wine Asia, that was a huge accolade. So I was, organising my tickets straight away. So pretty exciting.
And I can't wait to attend. So I will be there tomorrow. And I'm going to be really looking at the reactions of people in the audience. I've actually got a very random question. So I was at Pro Wine yesterday and I met a number of sommeliers coming around and trying the non-alcoholic wines. Yeah. And I have a question for you. Can you be a non-alcoholic sommelier?
Well, it's a very good question. And actually, New York, they have what I'm aware is the first global sommelier of a Michelin star restaurant that we're poured at. Sorry for the name drop. It's the Modern at the Metropolitan in New York. And Abe is the first sober sommelier, as far as I'm aware, and that's what he calls himself. And actually, there's another founder friend of mine, Ian Blessing, who's founded a non-alcoholic brand in America called All the Bitters. So it's an NA Bitters brand, and he and his wife worked as somms at the French Laundry, the famous restaurant, for some time, and then went on to create their own non-alcoholic. So I think it's not such an oxymoron. It's starting to make a bit more sense because actually for wine, so much of it is in the nose. I'm trying to work out what the sober somm does when he tastes or how it works. I'm sitting down with him shortly in New York at the bar over a glass of Noughty, so I'm going to ask him.
Please do. If you happen to find out anywhere that would be prepared to train a non-alcoholic sommelier as well. Any of the schools, maybe in France.
How interesting.
I don't know if any of them would be...
Is that something you want to do?
I'd love to do it, yeah. I would love to do it.
How interesting.
Now, a lot of the sommeliers that I met yesterday said, you know what, you can just spit it out. So you're not actually necessarily drinking the wine. The only problem is it's been 2 years since I've drank. And so whenever I have a sip of wine now, honestly, it just tastes like alcohol. It's the first thing that I can taste. So I don't know if I would be a very good in that, and I would really like to do it with non-alcoholic wine, and I'd like to get some form of certification.
I think we're a long way from that in the world in terms of official certification.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, but I like to hope that one day, as people push quality harder and harder, perhaps in 5 to 10 years.
Okay, I'm going to be first one.
There you go. Game on.
I'm going to try and get a certification for non-alcoholic.
Amazing. Well, there's lots of people around the world you could talk to. Laura Willoughby in London, who runs Club Soda, she'd have lots of opinions, I'm sure. I mean, I'll keep that in mind on my sort of global travels.
Amazing. The sommeliers yesterday said, well, actually, you know, you kind of work down a list of kind of questions that you're asking about the wine and about the taste and about the flavour. So there's no reason why that can't apply to a non-alcoholic
it's such an interesting concept. I'm friendly with a master of wine who's UK-based called Richard Bamfield, and he has discussed with me about this idea of how we don't necessarily need to taste in quite the same way, because, of course, all of our formal ways of tasting wine, for those who have trained in fine wine tasting, because I trained in Paris, you have all of this formulaic way of tasting, but that's built around the premise that the alcohol body is playing a key part of that, and the component of ethanol, essentially, for scientists out there. So once you take that away, and of course, what Rich and I were discussing is this idea of spitting the wine, because you're not, in theory, planning to drink all that alcohol. Of course, that becomes a redundant concept. So arguably, one has to tear up the conventional way of tasting. And what we always try and encourage people to do when they're looking to play around and taste our wine in a formal setting and looking at hospitality is actually to enjoy it with the food, which is where it really is working best in its natural habitat, you know, which of course is relevant to hospitality, because so often in wine, data's showing, even for those who still drink, the wine consumer leaves the table quite early if they're just having 1 or 2 glasses. And I was that consumer. I was kind of a wine nerd who was always actually quite fussy about what I was drinking, but I would never have more than 1 or 2 glasses. So I would be leaving the table, because a lot of wine drinkers stay in their lane. I think a lot of the non-alcoholic crowd kind of, or even the conventional alcoholic crowd, will go, oh, we've got non-alcoholic beer and we've got non-alcoholic cocktails. Actually, a lot of wine people don't tend to move over into those categories, the data shows. So there were millions of people around the world like me. And actually, all of that lost margin in hospitality becomes quite fascinating from a food and beverage perspective when you want to talk about money, because you might leave before dessert, you might leave before cheese, you might not stay for the party. And actually, there's been a lot of us doing that. And that's when it becomes really exciting, which goes back to that link with good non-alcoholic wine and those restaurant experiences, and how really they should be integral and integrated.
I think there's also that thing with non-alcoholic wines, though, is that I would only tend to drink 1 or 2, and then I'm done. Whereas with an alcoholic wine, if I have a third, then I'm probably having 4 or 5. You know, and I think a lot of bars say, oh, well, we want people to continue to drink more, and when they drink non-alc, they will tend to only have 1 or 2.
So it's not true with our brand.
Really?
No, not in hospitality, not when it's listed correctly. There's a couple of upscale hotel chains in the UK. If it's listed on by the glass, that's really the key. So say we were out together and you weren't drinking, as you don't. I only drink occasionally, so I might, if there was, a great champagne on by the glass, I might have 1 glass, if we were out on a Friday night having dinner. And then if Noughty, the sparkling Chardonnay, for example, is on by the glass, a lot depends on how it's listed. By the bottle, it's going to be problematic because most people are going to want to start with a glass. And it's a bit like alcoholic wine, right? I mean, so often around the world, people say, oh, I'll just have 1. Oh, I'll have 1 more. Oh, then shall we get a bottle? I mean, there's all of those classic kind of situations that happen in wine drinking. And so actually it's the by the glass thing that's key with our brand. And I also think because we are low in sugar, I think we're the lowest in market, not to be the lowest just as a sort of because we've been chasing that. I'm all about balance, as I was in conventional alcoholic wine when I had a Grand Cru champagne. For me, everything's about balance in wine. And so as long as it's listed correctly, you're living the dream if you're getting onto the by the glass conventional list and not an adjunct. Like if you're plant-based, do you happen to have a separate plant-based menu? You're living the dream really getting it on by the glass on the main list. And that's when you get that whole inclusive drinking piece for those who aren't drinking at all, but equally for those who are drinking, but then can seamlessly shift to naughty.
You've nailed something there when you said that kind of inclusive drinking, because often now, if there is a non-alc wine on the menu, there'll be one. Whereas, previously when you go for a nice meal, you'd maybe start with a champagne. And then you'd move on, maybe depending on the courses, the wine pairing, you might have like a red, a white, a dessert, or a white, a red, a dessert, whatever, in whatever order. And I think that's what's missing.
And I've always been about, recognising in my mind that replacing alcohol with high sugar levels, personally, I don't believe is really a good swap. I mean, you could argue probably one's worse than the other, and both arguments will probably be pertinent. And I think that is an issue in a lot of non-alcoholic brands that I certainly won't mention because I'm not here to do anyone down. But I also think that just to build up palate in non-alcoholic wines with sugar and chemicals is as much of a mistake as one would with cheap alcoholic wines. And I think Singapore is, interestingly, as I understand it, leading the market to some degree, even though the non-alcoholic wine market is still very slowly emerging with this sugar angle, because I've heard that you're going to be much more transparent about obligations for sugar levels, which becomes quite exciting for a brand like mine because we're not hiding anything.
So for any of our listeners, we have ABCDE colour codes on most of our kind of food products here, food and drink products, and it will be coming in for any non-alcoholic alternatives. It also annoys me a little bit that it should be on the alcohol. That information should be on there because, of course, the alcohol products are so high in sugar as well. I don't want to say it's perfect because I don't believe it's perfect, but it is telling you, the sugar content.
I think it's super useful. I mean, I think it's brilliant. As someone who travels the world and has always talked about sugar in wine, even when I had a champagne, I used to talk about it. For wine people, it's called dosage, but it's not really that well understood because we use a lot of French terminology and there's so many different terms you can use, brut nature, that it's quite confusing for consumers. So I was quite early in talking about sugar being added to wine. And I think that anything that just helps create some degree of easy clarity. In any industry, we overestimate the attention span that consumers from outside our industry are going to have to learn about it. And I just think anything that creates a shortcut. So I personally think that's a super useful sort of coding system to help people understand. I'm guessing that anything with that super high sugar, people are going to realise perhaps to be very careful about.
Yeah. And I think it's going to be great for brands like yourself. I do worry for the alcohol-free industry as a whole. People are just going to go, well, what's the point? And
but then I could argue if you're just creating sugary cordials, I personally don't believe that's desperately useful. Yeah. So I would perhaps controversially, I'm so sorry, say I would really rather that everybody doesn't pile into the NA industry with high sugar products because as I really believe that sugar is not any more healthy for you necessarily than alcohol.
Yeah.
Sugar where sugar's due, right? In your pastries. I always think sugar should be consumed where we know we are eating or drinking something sugary. I mean, whereas if something's got more sugar than the world's famous soft drink that begins with a C, but you don't realise, I mean, for me, those smoke and mirrors aren't ideal for consumers. So I personally, particularly in wine, which is really the only category I feel properly qualified to talk about, although I'm a bit worried about NA spirits as well because their sugar levels are super high. But winemakers, I don't believe, and I'll say this publicly, should be piling in and building up palate with sugar.
So tell me a little bit more about how wine is made and maybe where some of that sugar comes in because this is really interesting.
With non-alcoholic wine, I think the step that most people have missed, which sounds really obvious but isn't always shared, is you need to make a good wine to start with. This is if you're making a non-alcoholic wine that's removing the alcohol. Obviously, there are lots of teas and proxies and all kinds of brands that are doing different things. And I think the world eventually will need to clarify that non-alcoholic wine should be wants wine with alcohol removed, just to, again, create a bit more clarity for consumers. And that, there's absolutely a place for all kinds of other drinks, but if they weren't wine, it seems unusual and perhaps inappropriate to call them wine. So in theory, a non-alcoholic wine would start life as a conventional wine. But the important piece of the jigsaw puzzle, I think, that most brands have forgotten is, and it's obviously cheaper to make a bad wine. So it's cheaper to make a bad alcoholic wine and then de-alcoholize it. It's not so cheap and easy to make a good wine and then de-alcoholize it. So that's the key part. I think there's a lot of other parts of the equation. A lot of my fine wine training, it's almost like if you want to be a racing driver, you need to learn how to drive, but then you're going to obviously have different ways you're driving, I'm assuming, if you want to be Lewis Hamilton. I guess it was pertinent to me that I understood fine wine, but equally I had to rip up the rule book to some degree and start again, actually, because some grapes that I had a very particular affinity with, I was a Burgundy girl, so I used to love Pinot Noir. Now, Pinot Noir is a very difficult grape. It's a very delicate grape to make good alcoholic wine with. I mean, the best producers will tell you. So to actually make non-alcoholic Pinot Noir, it's also a very delicate grape. So you were getting things that were really quite thin, and that's when you're having to, I used to talk in alcoholic wine about tricking up the palate, chemicals, sugar, exactly the same process. So I had to play around really with lots of grapes, and a lot of grapes just don't necessarily de-alc very well just because of the expression. So it's quite a complicated thing, and I think the reason that non-alcoholic wine has had a bad name historically, because there were, it turns out, lots of legacy brands, but it wasn't like any discerning wine drinker would have had a relationship with them. I think because they hadn't perhaps been focused on quality, first and foremost, and they'd also been doing what a lot of cheap alcoholic wine producers do, which is, as I say, building up that kind of taste with sugar and chemicals. So it's actually not that dissimilar in that regard. And again, if you want to drive your price point down, that's how you do it. So it doesn't come as a surprise if you end up with something very thin and without much flavour. For me, the approach should always be to retain the vinous qualities despite removing the alcohol, and that's where the tricky piece comes in.
I'm really glad you touched on cost, because that's a question that I get all the time. Why is it the same price or sometimes more expensive than an alcoholic
And it's a really
wine?
easy one, I think, to answer in a frank way. Alcohol's ethanol. It's like one of the cheapest components ever. It's not actually an expensive component. I mean, sadly, why do we see people who aren't wealthy getting drunk, right? I mean, that's all it is ethanol. So actually that's not the component where anything like your budget's going to. And then it's the mindset of, if people are drinking to get drunk, they can still do that very cheaply, actually.
Yeah.
So you have to just shift the mindset. Also, any quality-led non-alcoholic wines or spirits or beers, at least to start with, made in relatively small batches and not, commodified in that kind of huge way necessarily. I mean, we're now set up to scale, but it took a while. Yeah. And so it's a very different way to approach things. So I always say to people, if you want something very cheap, then we're not going to be the brand for you. The quality will be correct for the price as far as I'm concerned. And I'm pretty happy that around the world our quality is correct for the price. And that's the same as when I had a Grand Cru champagne. I wanted the quality to be correct for the price. And of course, we all know with branding in wine, you've also got an element of history, art. Certain brands will command more for various reasons, whether that's cars, right? You can buy a cheap car, you can buy an expensive car. But for me, it's just about just being really honest and saying alcohol is ethanol, cheap component. We need to just get that out of our head.
I think it's just really understanding the process as well, is like the attention to detail that has gone into creating a product like Noughty. You're still going through that process of creating a wine, and am I correct in saying de-alcoholizing the wine at the end?
Exactly.
So actually there's almost more work going into that.
So you've got a two-step process exactly instead of the one. Yeah, that's bang on.
And if you want a sparkling grape juice, you can get a sparkling grape juice very
absolutely.
cheaply. You know?
And another reason why I think it's really important that anyone coming in to the industry, I always think they should raise me one on quality. I mean, you know, it's a crowded industry actually already. Every man and his dog is now launching a non-alcoholic wine. And for me, yes, of course, investors are piling in. The spotlight's on us in the media. I'm here talking to you. It's brilliant. But if people aren't focused on quality, this is the drinks business. And sadly already, many aren't surviving. So I think there's this sort of gulf between the commercial opportunity that a lot of smart people are recognising, but improve your quality. I always say to everybody who asks my opinion, you know, if they say they want to launch one, I say, well, focus on your liquid first. Oh, I've got this great brand. Focus on your liquid first. I got this great brand. It's completely the wrong way around. Of course, brand is important. It's super important to me with Noughty. But I was obsessional and continue to be about pushing my quality of my liquid, which is why I'm still here today, I think, and will continue to be. And so I think that it's important to recognise that in the market right now, because a lot of people are focused, I think, on the wrong things.
Yeah, there are some awful products on the market.
Right.
And I think it can really put people off. People who are maybe trying this for the first time.
That's a really good point.
Having a subpar product is not a great first experience, and immediately go, well, that non-alcoholic beer or alcoholic wine, alcohol-free wine is no good. I'm not interested. It doesn't taste good. How can you kind of overcome that as a category?
Taste. Yeah, I mean, for me, those become the most exciting clients, ironically, if you can sit down and have them taste. It's almost like if your negative perception is so bad, I can blow them away with my wine. You know, that's really where it all happens. And we wouldn't, you know, the reason I sit here and we poured around the world in Michelin star restaurants rather beautifully, so many now, which is just blows me away. In, you know, 5-star hotels, in the British Airways lounge when I was flying out with Japan Airways. So many wonderful, incredible trophy, high-profile accounts. I mean, you don't get those without having good liquid. And I think that's the reason for me why the PR becomes so important, because once you've got those qualitative stamps, I mean, you don't get to work with Michelin star chefs on their tasting menus, you know, if you're not good, right? So I think that's why it's so important to push that side of things. But I agree, if people's first perception is with, we don't talk about other brands, but if it's with something that, as you say, is awful or people don't like or is quite basic, you then have to take them on a faster, longer journey in that headspace. But I think the tasting then becomes all the more important.
And I think consumers are demanding more as well. I think, you know, now there are some great products on the market. People are expecting a certain level of quality, and they're wanting to see more. So you've got 5, amazing. Am I right in saying you've got 5?
Yeah, so
wines?
Going back to your interesting point about the tasting menu with alcoholic wines, I wanted to have one for every occasion in the meal. As I say, we haven't done dessert, and I probably won't, never say never, but I probably won't just because of the sugar levels. Yeah. So yeah, two sparklings, alternatives to champagne. My favourite champagne historically was a Blanc de Blanc, and 100% Chardonnay is all that means for those outside the wine world understanding. And white of whites, basically. My champagne, actually, Chardonnay did de-alcoholise very well, so I managed to create, that was the first one. And that we launched in 2019, just before the pandemic. And I'd just been building it out in London in the trophy accounts. Then, of course, we all know what happened in 2020. We don't want to talk about that. But it was an interesting nexus because the great and the good of the wine world came together online in a way they hadn't been before. And we'd had some phenomenal early press. chancesrobinson.com, they'd written about us. And then the New York Times started to write about us, and I got my first fine wine distributor in America pretty early then. And so I built out my brand during that time, really. And at that point, there was demand for the rosé. So I brought out the sparkling rosé, which is 100% Tempranillo. They're both organic. They're both halal certified. And then I pushed out the range of stills, which were a whole other challenge entirely. I worked with a different maker on those in South Africa, and I've got a red, Noughty Rouge, Noughty Blanc, and Noughty Provence-style rosé. The red caused me a lot of sleepless nights. And then Florence Fabricant from the New York Times put me on the food and drink cover, and I remember just sleeping like a baby. Because, of course, I'm not likening myself to a pop star or a famous author, but you all know you've had success in the media. And they always say the second book, the second album, you know. And I was like, oh, everyone's been so nice to me. You know, is this going to be my fall from grace with my red wine? And so that was a moment, really, when the New York Times wrote about us then. That was kind of crazy. The red actually now, my red Noughty Rouge is now, I think, my bestseller in the US.
What is your secret to the red? Because so many others have failed. Of all the non-alc drinks out there, it seems to me it's like the one that just hasn't quite hit the nail on the head for
Red's
a lot
tough.
of brands.
I mean, it's tough because people want the body, the burn, really. I mean, I always think when I'm tasting with the red, I sometimes even front it up and say, just in your mind, there's going to be no burn. Because, I mean, lots of people are doing interesting things in the proxy or, you know, wine adjunct market, whatever we want to call it. Things that aren't wine, essentially. They're adding chilies. And I love it when mixologists do that. For me, in my brand, it was all about the purity, which was what I used to do with champagne. I was like, how do I create delicious, elegant, non-alcoholic wines, but without playing around with them too much? I wanted them to be as pure as possible. And I love it when mixologists do wonderful things with my wines, as they are now around the world. And that's super exciting. But I love it when they do it themselves, because I feel like Noughty is, you know, like the palette of which you can use to mix. The true sort of mixologists are doing exciting things with cocktails with our wines. But the red, so there's no burn there. If you take the sparklings, if we're really applying that kind of conventional wine tasting tics when you're doing your training, if you're you know, you start your training as a sommelier down the line, we hope. The tick is mouthfeel. So with the sparklings, it's definitely not easier to make a good non-alcoholic sparkling. It's not easy at all. But you've got the tick of mouthfeel with the bubbles. Yeah. With red, people are expecting burn. So there's going to be no burn. Besides burn, you're also expecting some degree of mouthfeel, what they call in wine tasting terms, finish, which is where right at the end you're left with something. And I always think with my conventional wine when I had it, and now with my non-alcoholic wines, if we're tasting now, right, what am I eating? Oh, let's look at that Singaporean menu. What are we having for lunch? I haven't tried all your food yet. And the reason I think my wines are so successful in hospitality is chefs love them. You know, because they're like, okay, we get this. This will pair with that. This will pair with this. They're really best enjoyed with food, right? So I was really trying to create something that would work in that environment. And I actually had a sober chef in Texas, and he just started to go on Instagram to his wife. He's like, my wife's going to freak out. She thinks I've given up wine. He just went nuts for it because he, you know, and you'll find that actually a lot of chefs aren't drinking these days, even famous ones, and lots of hospitality professionals, because I think a lot of them realise to stay on their A game as they get older, you know, you can't, it's not like in your 20s, right? I think, you know, the 20-somethings, even though they're drinking less actually per capita, but I think those of us who've lived through our 20s, I think most people for various reasons are recognising that even if they're not giving up alcohol, that less is good for a number of their lifestyle reasons, whether it be health, whether it be sport, whether it be longevity, you know, you name it. And so the red, we're playing around with oaking. What happened with us was I was really frustrated with most things I'd tried. And my winemaker, we dry farm the vines in South Africa. And what that means is they are fighting so hard to get the water. And it's really almost arid out there when the sun's shining. I was out a few months ago and it was like, I think it was 35 degrees when I was out in the vineyard. So even hotter than Singapore, and no real humidity. Yeah, it was the very dry heat. And so what you get is you're really wanting those wine-like qualities. And I think that's what the grape was doing for me. Then you're just playing around with oaking. You're doing just different things with some of the blending. And yeah, there's a lot of artistry that I think goes into the making it. And at the moment, I'm super happy with my Rouge, but I'm also looking to create something that's different again, perhaps a more of a Bordeaux blend style, you know, just perhaps a little more elevated again, so with a slightly higher price point accordingly, perhaps just for hospitality. I'm always working to push quality. But yeah, anyone who hasn't tried the red, I'd love you to try. With your favourite food, it works really well with anything spiced. I mean, it really does.
Yeah, that's Yeah, even me on Sunday, we were eating steak, had a beautiful barbecue, and had a bottle of the non-alcoholic.
So the steak thing's interesting. We're working with Groucho in the UK at the steak restaurant, and I think, was it the Evening Standard? The London paper, yeah, they put Barolos and Crozes Hermitages and all kinds of fancy red wines on their steak list. And then Noughty Rouge popped up, the only non-alc. I think it was a list of 30 reds to have with steak. So that was lovely.
Awesome. It's so good. I just raising awareness, letting people know that these are available and they're worthy. You know, they're worthy for you to go out and try them. You touched on a minute ago various different reasons why people aren't drinking. What are you seeing just generally with consumer behaviour and how people's behaviour and attitude towards drink and alcohol is changing?
It's fascinating when you dig into the data because most people are drinking less across actually all demographics, right up to boomers. But it's just that the younger generation are being much more vocal about it and actually slightly are drinking factually less. But of course, they're so brilliant at sharing the message on social media, which is how it gets such dramatic cut through. It's really interesting. I think there's such a myriad of reasons, depending on the age group and, you know, the position. And I mean, I've just been blown away by people sharing all kinds of reasons. But what I love is we say we're a wine brand that happens to be non-alcoholic. And I think what's brilliant is really early in the US and the UK, where we sort of were growing quite early, the sober community found us like almost from day one. I mean, obviously, if anyone has an extreme alcohol issue from our old, obviously it may be triggering our wine. It's like wine. So we don't sell specifically to the sober community, but many have found us, which is lovely. Actually, just that kind of piece of recognition that there is something there for drinking seamlessly. And of course, I think a lot of people, because just around the world at higher levels, a lot of the drinks industry is still controlled by men historically. And I think a lot of, of course, drinking's not gendered. But if you dig in, for example, to sparkling wine, it will be more women still around the world in every territory who've historically drunk it. And so a lot of, I guess, the gatekeepers felt like non-alc was done because of beer. Because every brand now, I think every brand, I don't know, I might be surprised, almost every brand around the world, beer brands are pushing everything into non-alc now, and that's been a growth market for really quite some time. And wine had been left behind so drastically, like almost like it wasn't relevant. So I think a lot of the gatekeepers were pertinent to that, because we used to find, and we still do sometimes, if you talk to events people or weddings or whatever, people will go, oh yeah, we've got non-alc, and they'll be like, oh, we've got non-alcoholic beer and we've got juice.
Yeah.
And it kind of stops there.
For the record, that's not.
Right. Of course. And for me, it kind of
anymore.
blew me away to think that nobody was welcome at the celebratory moment with toasts of any kind if they didn't drink until really Noughty came along, which kind of blows my mind when I think about it, because we're then saying, because you know, historically people get poured juice, don't they, or some sort of really weird sugary cordial while everyone else is drinking traditional champagne. Kind of crazy. So getting back to your point, lots of people are using it for balance. Yeah. You've got that small community who found us from day one and don't drink at all, so they were on board. That balance thing's really pertinent, and I'm finding so many people are not drinking as much for a variety of reasons. But what's been fascinating is as well how people can build us into their private lives or public lives without a whole conversation. A lot of hospitality professionals love the fact that they can have a glass of Noughty Sparkling Chardonnay. Everybody else can be drinking champagne. It doesn't, obviously I love the PR, but it doesn't have to be noted the fact that they're not drinking. The same with my red. I mean, that's been a game changer for a lot of people because, and particularly men, I mean, if you dig again into red wine, of course, I think that a lot of men have come on board to our brand through our red wine. And I think that inclusive experience just means that you're not going to get that dreaded, or why are you not drinking, and which of course I think in maybe 5 years, but I'm being probably too romantic, perhaps in 10, that will just be the most irrelevant question ever.
Completely. I hope so. I stopped drinking, I stopped drinking 2 years ago, but I wanted to stop a lot longer before then. And I didn't, because I think first and foremost, I felt like I was letting people down. Every single person.
Which is crazy. Why should it be anyone else's business?
Yeah. But every single person in my life drank. And that's how we connected over a drink. That's how we celebrate, commiserate, catch up, spend our afternoons, And the non-alcoholic alternatives were just such a game changer for me. Being able to sit there and have a glass of wine and enjoy a sophisticated alternative, feel included, and it put everyone else at ease as well. I think just subconsciously them seeing me have a drink in my hand put them at rest.
It's so ironic though, isn't it? Because why should anyone care?
It is, right? But I think the world's changing, and more and more now when I say to people, it took a long time for me to even say the words, I don't drink.
Interesting.
Now, I didn't have an alcohol addiction. I hardly drank. I, don't have kind of a problem in that sense. It's just, I felt like I owed people a reason and an excuse. So it was, oh, well, I'm marathon training, or, oh, I'm on antibiotics, or, oh, I've got a bit of a headache. I used to lie.
Isn't that? It's so strange that we still do that, isn't it? Yeah. But we do, yeah.
Yeah. It took a while for me to say, oh, no, I don't drink, or I don't drink anymore. If you add the anymore, it opens you up to questions. So if you just quite frankly just say, oh, no, I don't drink.
Oh, because they expect you to have a dramatic story.
Yeah. Or then they immediately assume you've got a problem. Where actually just saying, oh, no, thanks, I don't drink, people tend to go, okay, fine. What it is doing, though, is opening up a lot of questions. People do say, oh, is that a new thing? Oh, I want to quit.
It puts a mirror up, doesn't it, to everybody else around you?
Yeah. And so many more people now have been really genuinely interested. I get more questions of people asking me how I do it and what I drink than people telling me I'm boring.
That's brilliant.
It happens a lot less now. My husband is a bit of a home cook. He is actually a phenomenal cook.
Oh, wow, lucky.
And he's, very lucky. I'm the baker, so I'm the bread and desserts, and he's the cook. And most Sundays we invite people around and we will host. We try to kind of mix it up, get some new people in every couple of weeks. And it's great. Everybody, as soon as we come, everyone turns up with a bottle of wine, of course. But I say, I don't drink, and I've got kind of a non-alcoholic bar, and we've always got non-alcoholic wine and beers in the fridge. And people are really, really excited. Oh, I want to try this. And honestly, we almost every Sunday end up on a bit of a tasting session with friends for them because they're more interested on, okay, well, I want to drink less. And I don't know how many people, if there are any people in the world that are holding their hands up saying, I want to drink more.
I'm sure there are.
There must be somewhere.
In certain party areas of the world.
So I think I did really want to talk to you about choice, because, and this is where Emma from Free Spirit
she's a rock star.
And she's just so great at talking about choice, about, okay, if you decide you don't want to drink Monday to Friday, but you still want to do it on a weekend, that's okay. There's no judgment, but we're going to offer you a fantastic alternative for the times when you don't want to drink, whatever reason. Nobody needs to know the reason. And I think just opening up that conversation so much more around
definitely
choice and the fact that there is a viable alternative that is as good, if not better, than some of the alcoholic versions that you might be drinking.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think it's difficult, any trend, I think I'm an ex-journalist way back before I trained in wine, and you can sometimes be a little ahead of a zeitgeist, right? And, just because we're sitting here having this conversation and we're both in the know in that world, it's very easy to kind of assume that the word is out there more publicly. And of course, for restaurants and hospitality professionals where, it's been very challenging economically around the world for a number of reasons for them. And I think that often the lever there to sell is when you get into that revenue piece and that lost revenue piece, which is saying, oh, I can understand if you're not interested, But let's just talk about the revenue you're losing. And that revenue lost figure is really the seductive piece, I think, for hospitality professionals, where you're going to say, what are you offering people who aren't drinking? What are you offering wine drinkers, for example, who aren't drinking? You know, and then it's kind of an easy lever once you get into that lost revenue piece. But you're so right. And I think it's brilliant work that Emma and you are doing just to raise that game more publicly and just to help people understand that there are brilliant alternatives out there, because I think it's easy in our echo chamber to assume that everybody knows that. But of course, even though Noughty's name is out there nicely, it's not out, you know, we're not a household name yet. So it's really important to be those trailblazers, spreading the word and sharing. So I think it's brilliant what you're doing around your house every Sunday.
Thanks. I think, honestly, I want more people to know about it, because it has changed my life, you know, okay, not just the sobriety element, but in having the non-alcoholic alternatives and being able to have that choice and still feel included. And even my parents, they are big drinkers. They are the most fun people you'll ever meet. But it was my mum actually who introduced me to Noughty.
Oh, I love that. From the UK?
Yeah, from the UK. Right. And I almost feel like you've been around much longer than 2019.
It's funny, isn't it?
She must have found you guys quite early.
Yeah.
And she, you know, decided that, okay, you know, I'll need to have a couple of nights off a week.
Right. And which age group's she?
She is in her 60s.
Okay, yeah. So it really cuts both ways. One thing I missed out, actually, when you get into the young generation, they're living their life, of course, online and on social media with cameras everywhere. They're very aware of it. Of course, we all are, but they're very aware of it. So I think that's been another sort of guiding principle of them not wanting to be drunk on camera, and that recognition, of course, when a lot of them are just starting out in their careers, that you don't want anything publicly online where you're not showing your best self.
I think I was the last generation of that. I'm in my late 30s. And so there's definitely some pictures online in places that I'd rather than not be, you know, from my uni days.
We've forgotten all about it.
Yeah.
She says frantically Googling that.
Quickly trying to get rid of them. But do you think that alcohol will be the next generation smoking?
Yeah. I mean, I talked about alcohol being the new tobacco, I think 5 years ago when I was doing a thought leadership speech. Absolutely. When we're long gone, it will. And that's not me being anti-alcohol. That's me being analytically factual in my mind. Because when I'm sort of studying the world and travelling and selling in different areas around the world, if you watch legislation, there's no doubt that's the way it's going. You know, I think that I don't think anyone smart would argue with that. And that's not me putting a personal judgment onto it. That's me talking factually.
I think look, we all know the negative effects of alcohol. And so for it going that way, that makes me feel really hopeful for my kids. You know, they are 3 and 4 at the moment. So, you know, that kind of makes it, I'm quite hopeful for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many people around the world focused on mindful drinking, and that's sort of, I think, Camille Vidal, who's from the UK but does a lot of work in America and around the world. She's French. You know, that piece is fascinating because it's just sort of saying, let's pause, you know. And I think, strangely, when I look back, I was probably privately a bit of a wine snob, because it's easy to be a wine snob when you're not paying. When I was in the arts world, and back in my day, I mean, I met my husband in Cannes at the film festival. I mean, everybody used to work hard and play very hard, but no one was taking pictures of us then. And I guess I got used to the good stuff in that regard. And so I guess I was, not always, but generally just a mindful drinker. I mean, I believe in addictive personalities, and personally, and I don't have one, which of course was useful in that regard. But I think that just that idea at the moment that we can all adopt, which is just being really respectful of alcohol. And if we want any sort of relationship with it at all, and great if we do, great if we don't, again, no judgment, just being discerning about what we're drinking. And that's why I would say to people, watch your sugar as well as your alcohol, and try and avoid sugar and chemicals as well as alcohol. Otherwise, you could be undoing all the good work.
Yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong, the reason why you wanted to create Noughty was because you wanted a healthier wine?
No, it was because there was nothing to drink when I wasn't drinking.
Okay.
Yeah, it was really just that idea. At my favourite wine dinners or events, I would be the one leaving early. So when I've analysed the data, as I said, there were millions of people like me. And it would be like, well, I'm a wine drinker, but I'm not drinking. Oh, I've had a glass of water. Okay, so it turns out that is that huge piece of lost revenue amongst wine drinkers staying in their lane, which takes me full circle on the importance of that by the glass listing on a wine list. And that way you get that beautifully inclusive bit where, oh, do you want champagne or do you want a glass of Noughty? I'm going to 67 Pall Mall tonight that I gather in Singapore, my friend Emma said was called Pall Mall.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pronounced differently. Yeah. The London Wine Club. So I was a member there, one of the first members. You've launched here in Singapore, the club. I'm going there tonight, and I think Noughty's the only non-alcoholic wine that they pour. And that really, for me, then is, you start to permeate the really elevated fine wine industry, and then you really have got this inclusive drinking piece that's coming together quite nicely.
And so for anyone looking to try a non-alcoholic wine, what should they be looking for?
Obviously, I'm biased. I'd go to noughtyaf.com. That's naughty with an O. It's a play on words. I think taste is everything, I usually say. My classic quote is taste is everything. But my caveat would be just make sure you're being aware of your sugar and chemicals. Not always easy with the way different countries have ingredients labeling. It can be very confusing. I think you will get what you pay for. So if a non-alcoholic wine is very cheap, it will unfortunately be for the same reasons as a cheap alcoholic wine. That's a fact of life. I know Singapore is, importing everything, right? So nothing's going to be cheap here if it's qualitative. Yeah. Try saying that again with jet lag, fast, qualitative. I think just be aware that you will get what you pay for. So be mindful of that. I guess with our sparklings, they're organic. We're a brand that wants to be transparent about what's going in the bottle. Yeah. So I just think just be aware of those things.
Yes. Oh, well, my sugar addiction is honestly absolutely through the roof. And I think since quitting the booze, I've definitely been enjoying the desserts a bit more than normal.
Yeah, I think that can be common, can't it? And I guess perhaps that's your next to-do list then.
Apparently it just takes some time as well for your body to adjust. But I just ran Paris Marathon.
Amazing.
2 weeks ago.
Is it appropriate to ask for time?
Yeah, of course. I did it in 3:51.
Wow, under 4.
Yeah, so really happy. Obviously, I've been training in Singapore.
I love that. In humidity.
Heat.
So Paris was cold for you. I did the Paris Marathon once, but I won't tell you my time. I stopped for a leg massage and I stopped for a glass of champagne before the end.
Oh, wow.
So let's not talk about my time. That's impressive. Well done you.
Thank you. The hills and the cobbles were underestimated.
It's tough. And there's that tunnel. Near the end, there's a tunnel. Yeah. And I remember when I did it was cold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We had good weather, 17 degrees. It was great. And it's funny, at the end of it, again, I got past a glass of champagne and a couple of, sips, and I was like, no.
You needed Noughty. We sell in Paris.
I needed Noughty. Couldn't find it though. Found it very hard in France to find.
It is in France, yeah.
Non-alcoholic alternatives. Yeah. Probably just they're very protective over their wine.
Well, Nolo House sells us in France.
Okay, I need to remember that one. So was obtaining the B-Corp certification a goal from the outset, and what does this commitment mean to you personally and in terms of the company's mission?
For those who don't know about B-Corp, I think the most famous one is the American brand Patagonia, and they have a famous sort of philosophy which is don't buy our stuff, which sounds counterintuitive, but they're all about reusing. So they'll often, if you send them a jacket of theirs that's ripped, they'll try and fix it. It's that idea of putting the planet alongside the heart of your business. So ethics, purpose into your share articles is quite challenging for companies, and particularly smaller companies, I would say. Well, bigger companies for different reasons. And of course, there's so much talk of greenwashing around the world. So there's a lot to sort of grapple with. But I was very focused early in business. I wanted to become the first British drinks brand. I think I was one of the first wine brands. I'm not that clear on the stats, but I know I was the first British drinks brand or wine brand to be certified out of the UK. And even though I produced my wines in Europe and South Africa. It was a challenge. It's not saying you're perfect by any means, because there's many things I do still that I would always like to improve upon. But each year you have to improve your systems. And it really, I remember a famous British entrepreneur saying it was a bit like allowing the organisation to rummage around in his underwear drawer. I think the metaphor for that is, there's really nowhere to hide with B-Corp as a business. Yeah. They kind of dig into every aspect of your business and see how you're doing it. Is it ethical, and can you improve upon it? So it was placing quite a lot of pressure on my own shoulders as the founder and CEO, but it was putting a flag in the sand to say we will do our best and continue to try and do our best, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's so important for the younger audience and the younger consumer to see this, right?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? They're shopping a lot more cautiously and they're more prone to doing research. So I think that the modern consumer will be putting that increasingly at the heart of their analysis, absolutely. So one could argue, yes, it makes sense commercially as well as for other reasons. Absolutely. I think it needs probably a lot more PR around the world, because I think because it's American, there's great PR and understanding in the US, which is our biggest market, but I think we need to spread the word around the world as well better.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
For coming to talk to me and coming to Singapore as well.
Well, real pleasure.
Great to have you. I'm really excited for your masterclass tomorrow. I'm really excited to see
No pressure. I've got to sleep off my jet lag now, haven't I?
Yeah, absolutely. And make sure you enjoy some beautiful food.
Oh, yeah.
And
I'm hungry.
Well today. Yeah. So one final question. Can you recommend anyone else in the industry that I should invite on the podcast that you think would be really interesting to talk to?
Oh, I've got a list as long as my arm. Well, Marcus Salazar, who's American-based, I worked with him to found Amber, along with another amazing group of powerhouse non-alcoholic American founders, people like Bill Schufelt from Athletic Brewing. He's got a whole incredible community. He's a source of all kinds of fascinating stories, because he was really at the heart of the NA movement very early on that side of the pond. I've mentioned Laura Willoughby on the UK side. I've mentioned Camille Vidal, also with me in the UK. There's some phenomenal leaders around the world. I'm more than happy to recommend or put you in touch.
Oh, I'm going to be tapping you up for all of those. That would be amazing. Thank you so much. I will link down below to, of course, to Noughty.
Amazing.
And social profiles, so anyone can find you there. Is there anything that you would like to say to the listeners before we say goodbye?
I'd just like to say that you've got an incredible woman here in Michelle doing brilliant work. Emma Pike, Free Spirit. I know your community is relatively small, isn't it? So amazing women doing amazing things. And I think it's brilliant to be able to work with powerhouse women around the world as well as men. I mean, that's pretty special. So I would say to anyone listening that having Michelle and having Emma here, who are both a mine of brilliant information and cheerleading, I'm super grateful. And anybody who wants to email via the website, noughtyaf.com. The AF is alcohol-free, to clarify. We had a bit of fun with that in the US, and that's naughty with an O. There's a link to email, which is hello@thomsonandscott.com. We've got no P. You can just click on the link, and those emails will come to me. Verity, my business manager, works with me on those, so it's really easy to email me direct.
Thank you so much. Enjoy your time in Singapore.
Thank you so much.
And I'll see you tomorrow.
Cheers.